a small bid for connection. Hearing another voice in the background left me cold, realizing he'd moved on. How had I ended up here, surrounded by strangers, regrets clawing at my every thought? Jeff slammed his plate onto the table, and as he loudly gulped his water and let out a burp, I couldn't hold back anymore. I'd reached my limit. "I want a divorce," I shouted. The words hung in the air, leaving both of us in stunned silence. For 6 months I'd kept this to myself, but now it was out. Jeff froze, still holding his glass in midair. "What?" he asked, his voice shaky and confused. He hadn't seen this coming, but there it was, and I wasn't about to take it back. It was time to be honest. "Yes, Jeff, I want a divorce. Surely you've noticed how unhappy I've been. Don't you realize I want out?" I waited, hoping for a response that made sense. "Well, I just thought," he trailed off. "Thought what?" I pressed. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "I thought, you're in your late 40s. I thought maybe menopause," he mumbled, almost too low to hear. I couldn't believe it. That was his big guess? "Menopause?" I said, gritting my teeth. "I'm 46, Jeff. I could have kids if I wanted." My frustration spilled out. I'd been holding so much back. He looked shocked, as if he hadn't expected this at all. "But I thought it was good," he stammered. "Really? You just roll over and start snoring afterward. Do you think that makes you a great partner?" I shot back. I knew I was being harsh, but I needed him to understand. Yes, there were some nice moments between us once, but those were rare now. After a while, I started wondering if there was even a point to trying, and the snoring didn't help. It was enough to drive me mad. After he'd fall asleep, I'd pour myself a glass of wine, watch a show, and wonder if anyone else had to put up with this for 17 years. I missed simpler times. We used to have fun. But since the kids came, joy seemed to leave our home, replaced by routines and stress. In truth, my frustration wasn't just about him snoring. It was more. I was unhappy with my life, feeling stuck. Jeff had a decent job at a toy company, and the kids adored him for it. But it felt so small. He had a degree in child psychology, but he just advised on kids' shows. My friends' husbands had jobs that sounded meaningful: mechanics, engineers, even a judge. Meanwhile, I was married to a guy who gave cartoon advice. It wasn't all about status, but I was disappointed. I hadn't expected to be selling commercial real estate, yet here I was, feeling trapped. And it wasn't just one issue with Jeff. He wasn't a terrible husband or dad. It was more like a mountain of small things. He made loud noises that were hard to ignore. He'd embarrass us all with his driving, speeding around in his sports car, and he had no appreciation for simple things like coffee. He thought my beer choices were boring and liked to sing pop songs loudly in the car, even when it made our teenage daughter, Maisie, cringe. She'd rather slip out quietly at school, but he'd insist on waving and greeting her friends. Then there were his messy habits around the house. He'd leave the bathroom in disarray, use my tweezers for his nose, and never remembered to put down the toilet seat. He'd get close to me at the worst times, usually when I was just finishing my makeup, making us late. I took over paying the bills after the power got shut off 3 times because he forgot. He never learned, and so I handled it. I was the one who kept things running smoothly, while working in real estate and earning more than he did, another fact he chose to ignore. Looking back, maybe it wasn't all fair, but I had to share this to help you understand. My parents had passed away, and my relationship with my mother was complicated. I wanted a life that felt more complete, more satisfying. But with Jeff, I was just tired. Whenever I achieved something, especially when helping others, my mother would brush it off with a comment like, "You're just not the clever one." That hurt, especially as a kid. It was even harder because my older sister, Tina, always seemed perfect. Tina was the ideal big sister. She worked on political campaigns and was the person everyone went to for advice. We haven't seen each other in years now. She moved to Washington, where she's living a great life on her husband's yacht. I hope she'll invite us to visit someday, but that hasn't happened yet. Meanwhile, I'm here in the Seattle suburbs doing well in business. Recently, our company was picked to sell a new building in downtown Seattle, which has kept us busy as big companies compete for office space. My friend Melissa got divorced recently. At first, she struggled, but now she's thriving. Every Monday, her stories of weekend adventures brighten my day. She starts with something unexpected, keeping us hooked. While she seems to be moving forward, I feel stuck, I just need a break, a chance to find myself again. Somewhere along the way, I lost who I was, maybe in my marriage or while raising our 2 kids. This wasn't the life I imagined. I know I'm not perfect. I can be picky, like my strong opinions on certain drivers or the trends that feel overdone and exhausting. Sometimes it feels like everyone's just trying to show off what they believe in, and it bothers me. So yes, I have my quirks. But still, I felt like I saw things more clearly than my husband. Deep down, I believed he must have felt something too. He'd try to talk to me, but his way of communicating felt simple, almost like he was speaking to a child. It left me feeling even more distant from him. Finally, I reached my breaking point and told him I wanted a divorce. The words hung in the air and he just looked at me, clearly hurt. But he needed to know. I wanted out. This wasn't the life I wanted, and if it had to end, I wasn't going to hold back. I believed my life could be better if things changed, and maybe it would help him too. I took a deep breath and softened my tone. Look, I said, I'm not happy. I don't think you are either. This just isn't working. I need to get out of this. As soon as I said it, I felt tears well up. He stepped closer, ready to comfort me, but he didn't realize he was the problem. No, I said, holding up a hand. Just sit down. He looked sad and confused. Jeff, I'm serious, I said, meeting his eyes. I want a divorce. I need my life back. He took a deep breath, his face falling. I understand, he said quietly. I can't stop you. His words were vague, the kind of talk I'd heard from him for years, and I just couldn't take it anymore. Just as I was about to respond, he said, I had hoped we'd stay together, but I guess not. His tone was calm, but it only added to my frustration. Jeff, listen to what you're saying, I replied, feeling worn out. He looked at me and I could see him start to pull back, shutting down as he often did in difficult moments. It was his way of guarding himself. I wasn't even sure how things would go from here. Divorce was likely, but I wasn't sure about the next steps. I knew that whoever kept the house would probably get primary custody of the kids, and that was where things got tough. I loved my kids deeply, but a part of me wanted to reclaim my life. I thought shared custody might be a good balance. Jeff had his flaws as a husband, but he was a good dad, and I knew he'd say the same about me as a mother. This arrangement might give us both the breathing space we needed. I'd already started looking at new places. I worked in real estate and had seen a beautiful 3-bedroom apartment in downtown Bellevue. It would be perfect, and I could afford to rent it for a few years before buying. It felt like the right choice, giving me a fresh start without the burden of maintaining the house. I wasn't trying to seem heartless. I loved my kids, and I wanted the best for them. This was just something I had to do for myself. We'd had 2 children together. We lost one early on, which had been hard for both of us. It wasn't my fault, and Jeff made sure I knew that. He was supportive, and eventually we had Maisie and then Andrew, whom we called Drew. They were my whole world, but I needed to find a way to be happy too. This was my chance to do that. My kids are the joy of my life. Parenting isn't easy, but that's just part of it. I took care of their needs, drove them to their activities, set up play dates, and planned fun nights. I'm sure Jeff felt the same way. He was there to help with their homework and stayed involved in their lives. But when it came to anything beyond basic things, like those tricky math problems, he was out of his depth. He always left that part to me. I hadn't worked out all the details for how a divorce would go, but I thought about it. If I told him to leave, he probably would. But it would take time, maybe weeks. I, on the other hand, could leave pretty quickly. I had options. I could stay with Melissa for a few days and figure things out from there. Maybe I could stay with Melissa for a bit while I sort things out, I suggested. He let out a scoff. Melissa? I should have known she'd be part of this. Jeff never got along with Melissa, though she'd never said anything bad about him to me. It was always me doing the venting when we were together. So you already have somewhere to go? He asked, sounding more hurt than curious. Yes, I replied, keeping my tone even. He looked straight at me. How long have you been thinking about this? I sighed. Jeff, it's been rough for a while now. Why? He pressed. I gathered my thoughts. We've drifted apart, I said, though it only scratched the surface of how I felt. Oh, I get it. You've drifted, he shot back. The moment you took that job, our life here wasn't enough for you anymore, was it, Jan? He paused. You've changed. I was happy you weren't." His words caught me off guard. In all our years together, he'd never spoken to me like that. He was always so polite, which was part of the problem. "Look," I said, trying to keep calm, "maybe I could move out for a while. We could take a break, no rush into a divorce. We could have some time to think about what we really want." I felt a sense of relief. I would feel free even if he didn't know that yet. I thought he might understand that this was the best choice for both of us. He sat there in silence, staring at me. "Can you say something?" I asked. "Like what?" he replied, his hands resting on the table. "You've clearly been thinking about this for a while. What am I supposed to do? Change your mind?" I opened my mouth, but I had no answer. He was right. These were my feelings, and they weren't going away. He looked at me a bit longer, then turned away. "Just go then. But I'm keeping the house. If you want to leave, then leave. Just don't come back." In that moment, I realized this wasn't just an argument. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. Our marriage was over. I tried to think of something kind to say to ease the pain, but I couldn't find the words. Anything I said now would feel empty. "I'll pack a few things and stay with Melissa for a few days while I figure things out. We need to talk about the kids," I said. He looked at me sharply. I'd seen that look before, and I knew I needed to be careful. "Relax," I continued. "I'm not trying to take them away. They're my kids, too, and I want things to be fair. Maisie's going to college in 2 years, and she'll be able to choose what she wants. I'm close to her, but I know how important you are to her, too. Drew needs stability, so he should stay here, close to his sister. I didn't want it to seem like I was ready to leave my kids behind. That wasn't true at all. I loved them deeply. I just needed a break to be a better mom, to make sure our time together was happier and not filled with stress. This wasn't about them, it was between Jeff and me. Jeff didn't say anything, so I took a breath and said, "I'll give you some space. We'll talk soon. I'm sorry, Jeff. We just need different things right now." With that, I went upstairs. Packing didn't take long. I'd thought about what I'd bring for weeks. I grabbed my essentials, phone chargers, makeup kit, 3 books, some clothes, and a few other things. In less than half an hour, I was back downstairs with 2 small bags and my backpack. Jeff was still sitting at the table. I hesitated, realizing how big this change was. This wasn't just a temporary step. This was a real shift in our lives. I was leaving the man I'd shared the last 18 years with. Part of me felt strong for choosing my own happiness, but another part of me felt sad for what was ending. I'd made the decision, not Jeff. He might not have taken this step, but I was ready for a new chapter. I looked around the kitchen, taking in the table and the glass of water. "I'm going to go now, Jeff. Please understand that this is something we both need." I paused, gathering my thoughts. "Don't tell the kids until I get back. We should talk to them together. They deserve to hear it from both of us." The initial tension faded as I spoke. I had made up my mind, and it felt strangely calming. Yes, I was sad, but also certain. This felt like the right step. Maisie was at a sleepover, and Drew was away on a school trip, both set to return Friday. I planned to come back then to have the hard talk with them. I was already thinking about what to say. Without looking at me, Jeff muttered, "Just go." I gave the room one last look, picked up my bags, and walked out, locking the door behind me. As it clicked shut, I thought I heard something from inside, but I took a deep breath and walked away. This was it, my new life was starting. Jeff would have his own things to work through, as we all do. On the way to Melissa's, I gave her a call, and she welcomed me with a simple, "Well, it's done. Let's make the best of it." She didn't press for details. She just opened her home, letting me settle in. The relief of those first 2 days was immense. I realized I only had to think about myself now. I didn't have to adjust my days for someone else's habits or quirks, no one to deal with but me and maybe Melissa's obsession with dance moms. I read 2 books, relaxed, and felt the tension melt away. By Friday night, I was ready to have the conversation I'd been dreading. Talking with the kids went better than I expected. Maisie wasn't really surprised. She just wanted to know if she'd have to move with me. Drew was more curious about the logistics, asking how it would work. Some of his friends had divorced parents, and he saw the perks 2 birthdays, 2 Christmases. His main concerns were which parent he'd spend most of his time with and if he'd have to call anyone else mom or dad. They were remarkably strong. The only one who really struggled was Jeff. I could hear the strain in his voice as he tried to explain things to them. This was hitting him hard. He wasn't prepared for it, and it showed. I hadn't planned for things to happen this way, but here we were. This wasn't something I'd mapped out, just something I had quietly considered for a while. Now, it was real, and we both had to move forward. As the evening went on, I realized Jeff was just starting to grasp what was happening. This was something happening to him, rather than something he had a say in. In a way, it was because of him. Maybe if he'd been different, things would have turned out another way. But this was our reality, and we both had to find our own paths. After the kids went upstairs, probably listening from the hallway, Jeff and I had another talk. I know you don't want to deal with this now, but I need to plan when I can come by and get some things, I explained. I have an apartment now, and I'll need a few pieces of furniture. What kinds of things? He asked, not looking at me. I'm thinking the coffee table, the extra couch, the bed in the guest room, nothing that you really need, but I need some basics. Jeff looked at me with a steady, distant gaze. I had never seen him look that way before, and it was unsettling. Fine, he replied. I'll be here on Monday to make sure you don't take anything we still use. I'll take the afternoon off so the kids aren't here. His voice was sharp but calm. He had the flexibility to take time off, and I could work around his schedule, so it seemed manageable. I just needed to arrange for a truck to move everything. I had decided not to take any of the electronics or entertainment systems. I wanted to start fresh. Just so you know, I added after a pause, there's no one else involved. I'm not leaving because of anyone else. I want you to be clear on that. Jeff looked at me, his expression still distant, and gave a brief nod. That was it. When Monday came, I showed up with a couple of friends from work to help move the heavier items. Jeff stood by, watching as I took what I needed. He let me take the wedding albums after I promised to make copies and return them. The only thing he wouldn't let me take was anything from the kids' rooms. I didn't plan to, though I wanted to create a new space for them at my place, somewhere they could feel comfortable. I didn't take anything that I knew held special meaning for him, like the sideboard from his mother or the family heirloom dishes. Those things didn't matter to me, and I didn't want to stir up any unnecessary conflict. Within 3 hours, I was done. The only thing that bothered me was that while I wasn't trying to cause any problems, Jeff seemed to be. As I left, he handed me an envelope, and I instantly knew what it was. He had moved faster than I expected. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. It meant he had let me go, which was what I wanted, but I felt a bit thrown off that it wasn't happening entirely on my terms. If he wasn't fair, things might get tricky. The next day, after unpacking, I looked over everything he'd sent. It was pretty reasonable. He offered a modest monthly support amount, which I could easily cover on my own with the right clients, along with child support. He proposed shared custody with the kids, mainly living at his house. This arrangement felt fair to me. I'd get one major holiday each year, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, or Christmas, and he'd get the other two, alternating every year. Birthdays would be shared. I'd have the kids every other week and weekends. It felt balanced, so I signed the papers without needing a lawyer. My new life was starting the way I'd hoped. I tried to reach out to my sister Tina to let her know what was going on. I managed a call from her boat, but the connection was poor. She and her husband Bernard were using a radio instead of a satellite phone, which seemed odd considering most people have one for sailing. I got through to her, but she kept saying, "Don't rush into anything, Jan. Just wait for me." It felt like she thought I was impatiently waiting for her to fix things. Then the call dropped, leaving me alone to handle my life. Except for the kids, of course. That feeling of independence didn't last long. I decided to wait at least 6 weeks before stepping back into dating. I'd told Jeff there was no one else in my life, which was true. I was officially single, and new possibilities were out there. Melissa encouraged me to be her wing woman, which sounded fun, but I wanted to find my footing first. I didn't want to jump into another relationship right away. I was proud of how I'd handled things with Jeff. Our separation was about my own happiness, not someone else. I wanted to make sure I wasn't running away, but choosing what was right for me. Friends were curious about the split, asking if Jeff had been seeing someone else. I told them that wasn't the case, but kept the details vague. It wasn't anyone's business. It took 6 weeks to get fully settled in my new home and set up the kids' rooms as they wanted. Drew asked for a big TV and a new gaming system, so I made it happen. Maisie only wanted a lock on her door and didn't care much about anything else. She was spending more time at friends' houses for homework. I checked with her friends, but I sensed she was pulling away. I even tried talking to Jeff about it, but he only wanted to communicate through email. Neither Drew nor Maisie would tell me much about their dad. I wasn't trying to pry, but when I asked a couple of questions, Maisie looked at me and said, "Didn't you give up the right to know what Dad's doing?" I paused, then replied, "Yes, sorry, I won't ask again." It stung to be talked to that way, but she was right. The whole point was to move on from a difficult situation, so maybe it was best to focus on the future. It would have been nice to know we were both better off apart, at least for now. In reality, it was better to think of it as forever. If I wasn't going to hear about their dad, he wouldn't hear about me either. So I said, "I guess that means he won't know what's going on with us, right?" She just stared at me, thinking it over, and finally said, "He never asks, so you don't need to worry about it, Mom." I shrugged, but it hurt to know he wasn't missing me. He had always leaned on me more than I leaned on him, so I thought he'd struggle with my absence. By the end of the 6 weeks, I felt ready to start dating again. The divorce papers were signed and in progress. I wasn't legally free yet, but I felt emotionally ready. In my mind, it was time to open up to new possibilities. 8 weeks later, I realized I needed to pace myself. I'd been going out almost every night, enjoying bars and shows, things I hadn't done in years. I signed up for evening classes in literature and flower arranging, and I was becoming quite skilled with flowers. I enjoyed discussing works by Dickens and attending shows Jeff would have never liked. I joined a gym, started working out regularly, and even updated my look, changing my hairstyle and wardrobe to match this new version of myself. I wanted to enjoy how I looked while I could. I went on a weekend trip to Las Vegas with friends, and we had a great time. One night we saw a show, went to a club, and met some younger guys. My date, Josh, was 7 years younger than me, and while it was exciting, it was also a bit disappointing. He was nice, but inexperienced, and we didn't even exchange contact information. Surprisingly, it left me feeling let down. Even my ex, Jeff, had been more attentive. But I reminded myself it was just one night. Getting back into dating was more about finding my own way again than about finding someone else right away. From what I heard, the other girls had better luck with their dates, but that's how it goes. I didn't mind that most of them were married and just out for a fun night. They'd supported me when I left Jeff, and I didn't want to make a big deal about a brief date that didn't mean much. When we got home, I decided it was time to ease up on the nights out and the drinking, so I set up an account on eHarmony and waited to see what would come of it. That's when I met Tom. Tom was great, easy to talk to, interesting, well-traveled, and well-read. He was everything Jeff wasn't. We went on 3 lovely dates, and for the last one, he even took me to the opera. I'd never really understood opera. The stories can be confusing, and the languages are foreign, but the singers were so talented. Sitting there, watching them perform in such an elegant setting, was an experience. When I closed my eyes, I could just enjoy their voices. Tom was tall and slim, different from Jeff, who was shorter and stockier. I appreciated Tom's unique style, even though he had some thinning hair and a few quirks. Those things didn't bother me because I enjoyed spending time with him. We even spent a weekend on his small houseboat in Sausalito, which was a refreshing experience. I realized that my earlier attempts at dating were a clumsy way to relive some lost youth. With Tom, things felt kinder and calmer. He didn't know me like Jeff did, but it was exciting to discover new things about each other. Tom even brought me flowers, a thoughtful gesture I hadn't seen in years. However, Tom had some unexpected quirks. After our intimate moments, he'd express his gratitude in ways that caught me off guard, leaving me unsure how to respond. I wanted a partner, not someone who needed so much reassurance. Jeff had been different. He'd make a light-hearted comment and go grab a drink afterward. Now, with Tom, I was exploring new emotions and hopes. In some ways, Jeff's casual ways felt refreshing compared to Tom's habits. But over the next few months, bigger issues started to show. Tom had a real problem with anger. Thankfully, he didn't direct it at me, but he'd get worked up over little things. Big issues like politics? No problem. But if someone cut him off in traffic, he'd fume. If a restaurant got his order wrong, he'd complain loudly to the manager. He even had a list of places he refused to return to because, in his words, those people don't know what they're doing. I suspected some of these places had probably asked him not to come back because of his behavior. Oddly, in serious situations, he could stay calm. We once got into a minor car accident, and he was calm and helpful to everyone involved. But the moment someone slowed down to look, he'd get furious. I found myself apologizing for him often. I understood his frustration with certain things, but his reactions were just too extreme. As I got to know him better, I realized his anger was affecting his work too. Tom was a trained home inspector, but he had lost several jobs because of his attitude. He was skilled at what he did, but tough to work with, so he started his own business, which was struggling. On difficult days, he'd vent to me about his clients, and I'd listen, thinking of my own responsibilities. He didn't want to discuss things, he just wanted me to agree. Eventually, I stopped listening as closely. It all became clear one night when he criticized something I'd said about Jeff. We were out for dinner, and he started a rant about a child he'd seen at a recent job. This child had a habit that Tom found annoying, and he was especially harsh about it. I thought to myself, even when I was frustrated, I never spoke this way about Jeff. I had always tried to be fair and understanding, even when things were hard between us. I remember talking with friends about Tom. Since I'd been dating him longer than they'd been with their partners, I had more stories. They laughed at some of Tom's quirks. Melissa would joke, "If he has a brother, keep him away from me." Cindy would ask if the good parts of my relationship balanced out the odd ones. Joni just smiled and said, "There are plenty of other people out there. Don't settle." But none of that was why Tom and I eventually broke up. It wasn't just because he drove a Prius I could live with that. It wasn't even his irritation with how I watched TV, though it bothered him. Sometimes I'd leave the volume low just to see his reaction. The main issue was his dislike for kids. It became especially clear when he talked about how he felt about my children. I'd been careful to keep my kids and Tom separate because I wanted to be sure about him before introducing them. Maisie had mentioned their dad a few times, and I wasn't sure if they were telling Jeff anything. I didn't want him finding out I was dating someone new, not yet, anyway. I wasn't exactly sure why it mattered, but it did. I doubted Jeff was thinking about it, so I decided not to bring it up. It took me 2.5 months before I even told the kids about Tom. Tom knew I had kids and didn't mind staying away when they were around. Now I understood why. One Sunday I decided to introduce them. I was nervous, hoping they'd get along. Tom promised to be on his best behavior. I hadn't told the kids he was coming, thinking it might be easier that way, especially since Maisie had been acting a bit distant lately. The meeting went okay. Maisie kept her usual distance, while Drew tried to talk to Tom and find things they had in common. It was going as well as I could have hoped. Tom was trying, but he seemed a little uncomfortable. Looking back, the signs were there. Tom had never been married, and we'd never talked about how he felt about kids. I thought it just hadn't come up, but now I realized he avoided the topic. He must have known that his feelings wouldn't be well received. What I didn't realize was that he seemed to have an issue with younger people in general. That Sunday, I had to run to the store for a last-minute dinner item. When I came back, the house was quiet and Maisie's door was closed. Drew was on the couch wearing headphones and playing a game. I put the bags down in the kitchen, grabbed a glass of juice, and went to check on Tom, who was sitting with his iPad. He didn't ignore me, but he wasn't exactly chatty. I called for Drew, but he didn't answer, so I decided to knock on Maisie's door, hoping she might want to talk. After a moment, Maisie opened the door, looking ready to leave. She insisted on going back to her dad's right away. She walked into the living room without looking at Tom, then tapped Drew on the shoulder, saying, "I'm ready to go. Are you coming?" Drew nodded and quickly gathered his things. I tried to change their minds, saying, "But I'm making roast beef your favorite." But they were determined to leave. Maisie even took out her phone and asked, "Should I just call Dad to come get us?" At that moment, I knew I couldn't win. I felt disappointed as all my dinner plans seemed wasted. But during the drive back to their dad's house, I knew I had to find out what had happened. Maisie sat in the front seat, arms crossed, staring straight ahead. Drew was in the back, looking out the window. "Okay," I said, trying to stay calm. "What's going on? What happened back there?" Maisie sighed loudly, looking away from me. I softened my tone. Maisie, please talk to me. I can't help if I don't know what's wrong. What's wrong, Mom? Is it because you think Dad isn't exciting enough that we have to deal with people like Tom? She snapped. Her words surprised me. Honey, what do you mean by difficult situations? You don't have to... Maisie cut me off, turning to me. He was so out of line, Mom. Apparently I don't dress the way he thinks I should or act the way he expects. I guess I'm not what he wants me to be. I was shocked. He did what? He actually treated you that way? Yes, Mom, Maisie shouted, and I was so taken aback that I accidentally swerved, narrowly avoiding the car in front of us. I took a deep breath, steadying myself from the close call and her unexpected words. We drove in silence for a moment before I gently asked, Maisie, can you tell me what happened? I need to know. Maisie sighed again. The second you left, he started lecturing us about how kids should act, how things were in his day, and how kids should be seen but not heard. When I told him he wasn't my dad and I didn't have to listen, he grabbed me and shook me, saying girls like me needed a wake-up call. Drew chimed in from the back. I even stepped in, Mom. I knew he was trouble. We're not going back if he's around, right, Maisie? Maisie looked back at Drew, who nodded firmly. Absolutely, sis, he said, crossing his arms. Just then, someone honked behind us and I realized the light had turned green. I pressed the gas, trying to process everything. This was serious not just because of what he'd done, but because it would take time to rebuild my trust with the kids. I also worried about what Jeff would say. He'd find out soon, and if he saw Tom at my place, I wasn't sure what would happen. Maisie, I am so sorry, I said, my voice heavy with regret. And you too, Drew. That was completely wrong. I know for sure that Tom is in big trouble with me. I had no idea, and I regret all of this deeply. I had raised my kids to be honest, and I knew they wouldn't lie about something like this. If they said it happened, I believed them. As we approached their dad's house, I parked and unfastened my seatbelt. Before they got out, I said, Please, can you give me an hour to ask Tom to leave before you tell Dad? You know he'll come over the minute he hears. And if he finds Tom there, well, it won't go well. I really don't want to see that kind of scene. Can you give me just a little time to handle it? Maisie glanced at Drew, who looked back at her. After a moment, he nodded. Okay, Maisie said. But I don't want to come back anytime soon, Mom. Can we wait a couple of weeks? We both need time to cool off. Oh, Maisie, I replied, trying to cheer her up. How about I take you both away for a weekend next week? We could stay at a hotel in the city or maybe drive to Portland or Vancouver for a little getaway. I really want to spend time with you. I could see she was considering it. Maisie loved Vancouver, and Drew would likely go along with whatever she chose. I'll think about it. Bye, Mom. With that, she and Drew got out of the car, leaving me alone, feeling upset and hoping my relationship with them wasn't damaged beyond repair. As I drove back, I thought about what I'd say to Tom. I believed what my kids told me. They'd never lie about something so serious. Still, I wanted to hear Tom's side of the story. It made me uneasy just thinking about it. But I needed to stay calm and let him explain. When I walked into the condo, I was nervous but steady. Tom was sitting on the couch watching TV, barely looking at me as I came in. I went to the bedroom, grabbed a box, and started packing up his things from the bathroom. Then I returned to the living room, set the box on the coffee table, and turned off the TV. Can you explain why I had to take my kids home after hearing that you were disrespectful to my daughter, Tom? I asked, keeping my voice low but firm. He looked away for a moment, then finally met my eyes. She deserved it, he said. She's disrespectful and that boy just sits around. He's not even family. They are my family, I replied, voice steady. They both need to learn a lesson. They should be grateful for all you do for them, he argued, clearly uneasy but not understanding the seriousness of the situation. Tom, I said, raising my voice slightly, they're not your family. And after today, they never will be. I crossed my arms. You need to get your things and leave. The only reason I haven't called someone to help me make you leave is because of the good times we had. I'd hurry, though, because Maisie is telling her dad what happened, and he'll be here soon. It's time for you to go, Tom, and don't come back. He looked stunned, but he tried to make one last attempt. Jan, listen. Sometimes I just get intense. I think kids these days need more discipline. Your kids are a good example of that. he said, reaching out toward me. I took a step back. And you thought treating my daughter that way would make me agree with you? Get out, Tom, now, or I'll call for help. I took out my phone, turning it on to show I was serious. Looking back, I realized I was more angry than afraid. I wanted him out right then. The thought of danger hadn't crossed my mind, though maybe it should have. You have 30 seconds, Tom. Go, and be grateful I'm not waiting for Jeff to get here before you leave. Tom looked defeated, picked up the box, and said, I thought we had something, Jan. I guess you're just not ready to be a real partner. I'm not surprised after everything you've been through. With that, he walked to the door, gave me one last look, then left, slamming the door behind him. I let out a long breath, realizing I'd been holding it in. I felt shaky, a mix of relief and frustration. I poured myself a drink, then another, feeling the calming effect. About 20 minutes later, there was a loud knock at the door. Somehow, Jeff had made his way in, even though entry was usually restricted. I sighed, got up, and opened the door. Jeff's eyes were blazing with anger. He walked in without waiting for an invitation. I didn't have the energy to stop him. He's not here. I made him leave, I said, exhausted. I knew Jeff would want to check for himself, so I let him. Jeff, usually calm, was tense as he walked through each room, checking everything. Satisfied that Tom was gone, he came back to the kitchen where I was pouring a glass of wine. I suddenly felt drained. All my energy was gone, leaving me frustrated and defeated. I offered Jeff a glass. He looked at it with a look of disgust. Suit yourself, I muttered, setting his glass down and taking a sip of mine. So, the single life, how's that working out for you? He asked, sarcasm heavy in his voice. Jeff, I don't have the energy for this right now. He's gone and he won't be back. I'm sorry our daughter had to deal with that. I truly didn't know he acted that way around kids. I don't know what else to say. Well, I do, Jan. I'm calling child services. You need supervised visits until we can be sure the kids are safe. This can't happen again. Clearly, your judgment is off. His voice was firm, and he looked at me with disappointment. Your daughter doesn't want to come back, and neither does Drew. You've pushed your whole family away. Well done, Jeff said, his tone sharp. I hope whatever you're doing is worth it. I'll see myself out. This was a new side of Jeff, angry and hurt. I knew I was the cause. Part of me wished I'd just been content, just stayed. But I also knew I deserved more, and I was ready to go after it, even if it meant leaving parts of my old life behind. As Jeff walked out, I called after him. Jeff, if you care about us at all, please let me see the kids. They're all I have left. The door closed as I softly said, I'm sorry. I took another sip of wine, staring blankly at the wall. The next 3 months were rough. Work was busy, though, and going well. I was managing leases for 3 big downtown buildings and 1 in Redmond, earning enough to consider buying the loft I was living in. It was expensive, but I figured it would be a good investment over time. True to his word, Jeff filed for limited visits, bringing in Child Protective Services. We all spoke with a psychologist, and surprisingly, he didn't get the restriction. The reports found my choice in partner to be the problem, not my parenting. Jeff wasn't happy and sent a few harsh emails. He was angrier than before, and Melissa reminded me that I played a role in that. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, I replied, trying to remind myself that we both had our issues. The first time I saw Maisie after all of this, she greeted me with, So, what new guy do you have for us today, Mom? It only got worse from there. Both she and Drew made it clear they didn't want to be there. Jeff sent an email after that weekend saying he wouldn't force them to come. If I wanted a relationship with them, I'd have to earn it. I could have pushed back, but what good would it have done? Forcing the kids wouldn't help, so I set aside my frustration and focused on making our time together enjoyable. I took them on fun trips a weekend at Disneyland, then a visit to the big meteor crater in Arizona, which Drew was excited about. I needed Jeff's permission to take them out of state. He gave brief replies but let them go. 3 months later, the divorce was final. I spent that day alone. It felt like freedom, but also a loss. I spent the evening with a glass of wine, flipping through old photo albums, smiling at the good memories. Not everything had been bad. Melissa and Cindy wanted to celebrate, but I realized I didn't feel like going out. It felt more like closing a chapter than celebrating a victory. A week later, while I was out with friends, I met Lincoln. He had shaggy, curly hair, a tanned face, a big smile, and the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. We met at a cozy bar in Bellevue that Melissa had found. Lincoln turned out to be a theater critic, traveling to see shows and writing for a popular blog. He was also working on a book, which sounded exciting. He was easy to talk to, full of interesting stories from his travels and insights about different cultures. Lincoln made life feel fresh and fun. I felt a rush of excitement just being around him. Our time together was always a surprise, filled with new experiences and laughter. Around this time, the kids started warming up to me again. Maisie got a boyfriend and suddenly wanted my advice. Drew began chatting more, though I noticed Jeff was missing from her updates about her life. This time I was careful. I didn't introduce the kids to Lincoln even though he asked about meeting them. I just smiled and said, "Soon, when the time is right." I wanted to be certain before bringing them together, maybe after he proposed, or if our relationship reached a new level. Marriage was a confusing idea. I wasn't sure if I wanted it again. I'd just come out of an unhappy marriage. Did I really want to change my life again to fit someone else in? I talked it over with Cindy and Melissa one day at lunch. Melissa greeted me with her usual hand wave. I always found it a bit funny, but I sat down and ordered iced tea, trying to stay calm. Cindy arrived a few minutes later, and as Melissa raised her arm to wave, I leaned in and whispered, "Please don't." She lowered her hand, looking a bit unsure, then sighed just as Cindy took her seat. "So, ladies, what's new?" Cindy asked. "I've been thinking," I started. "Oh, no, don't do that. You'll overthink it and do something you'll regret," Cindy joked. I glanced at her to show I was serious. As I was saying, I've been thinking about this thing with Lincoln. I think he really cares about me. I get the feeling he might want to take things to the next level, maybe even move in together. "Seriously? Wow, Jan, you're moving fast," Melissa said. "Well, it's not entirely my choice. I left Jeff to take control of my life, and I'm not sure if getting serious with someone else is the right move right now." "Absolutely not. You go, girl," Cindy chimed in. "Live your life," Cindy said, lifting her glass of water in a toast. Melissa nodded, thinking. "This is tricky," she began. "You left Jeff because you didn't think he was the right person for you, right?" She made air quotes. "So that means there's someone out there who is. What if Lincoln is the one? What if he's not just a temporary distraction, but someone you could really be with? Things are going well, aren't they?" She shared a knowing smile with Cindy. I shifted in my seat, still feeling a bit unsure after last night, but I managed to smile. "Feels like a good match," I said, raising my glass. "Yeah, you sly one," Melissa teased. I shook my head, still a bit uncertain. "But what if he's not the right one?" I pressed. "I just don't know. I don't feel any rush to jump into something serious, but I also don't want to miss the right chance if it's there." "Do you think he could be the one?" Cindy asked as we placed our orders. "Honestly, I don't know," I admitted. "He's easy to be with and we get along, but I can't picture what a future with him would look like." "The only way to find out is to give it a try," Melissa said after a pause. "But don't feel pressured to decide right away. If he brings it up, see how you feel. If you're not sure, give yourself some time." I considered this and nodded. She was right. "Yeah, you're right. I've been looking at it like if not him, then who's next? Even if he doesn't end up being the one, there's no rush. I mean, just look at me," I joked, smiling. "But am I even ready for something serious? I just got out of a tough marriage." Melissa's expression softened and she looked away. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Jan, listen," she said. "You often talk about Jeff in a negative way, but he wasn't all bad, was he?" "Well, no, but Tom was different. Saying he's not Tom just means he's not awful, of course. I wouldn't have stayed with Jeff if he were terrible. Why do you ask?" "Jeff did nice things too, right?" Melissa continued. "Like bringing flowers or remembering special dates?" "Yes, but where's this going?" I asked, confused. "I just mean guys who do that aren't as common as you think," she replied. "You've got high standards and there's nothing wrong with that. I just wonder if you're sometimes focused on what's missing." I took a breath and nodded. "I get that. But I still think I deserve someone who treats me well, and if he doesn't, then that's a deal breaker. Wanting the best doesn't make me picky, it just means I know what I need." I leaned back, feeling a bit more confident, but I knew it wasn't always that simple. It's easy to get caught up in what's missing and forget the good moments. Yes, Jeff was good in some ways, but he just wasn't the right fit for me, I continued. It's easy to miss the good when you're focused on the things that aren't working. Melissa gave a small laugh, though it sounded a bit forced. Well, I'm glad you've got it all figured out, Jan. So what do you think the one actually means? She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table, and Cindy propped her chin in her hands, clearly interested too. I blinked, thinking. It was a good question. Honestly, I'm not sure. I think I can tell you more about what I don't want than what I actually do want, I admitted. With Jeff, Tom, and now Lincoln, I'm learning what I can't accept rather than what I'm truly looking for. Like what? Cindy asked, smiling. Oh, little things like leaving the toilet seat up, I joked, though Cindy and Melissa exchanged looks. Okay, seriously, I said, laughing. I don't want to feel unappreciated. I work hard just like he does. But after a long day, I don't want to come home to more chores. And if I treat myself to something nice, I don't want that dismissive attitude. Sometimes you need a little self-care to feel good. And speaking of which, I continued, why do guys feel the need to comment on what I watch on TV? So what if I like silly shows? But no, some of them just have to let me know how much they hate reality TV. I imitated Jeff's voice, which made Cindy laugh and Melissa grin. We all had our guilty pleasures. Melissa watched Sister Wives, Cindy never missed The Real Housewives of Orange County, and we all loved The Good Wife. I know this sounds minor, but I have standards, I said. I expect kindness and respect, and I'm not settling for less. Life's too short. Melissa nodded, and Cindy clapped her hands. Yes, you tell him, Melissa added, though I cringed a bit at her words, knowing we'd need to talk about that later. For now, though, I was hungry. Shall we order lunch? I asked, picking up a menu and signaling to the waiter. Then there was Lincoln. Weeks passed, and at first, things were great. But by the 4th or 5th week, I noticed some things. I wouldn't say the spark was gone, but the excitement had faded a bit. It was like seeing things more clearly for the first time. Small things started to stand out. Lincoln was tidy in some ways, but surprisingly messy in others. He left clothes scattered on the bedroom floor and wet towels in the bathroom. Yet his huge book collection was organized by author's last name, and he'd sigh dramatically if anyone returned a book to the wrong spot, carefully putting it back himself. When it came to his books, borrowing was out of the question. His reasons ranged from silly to downright ridiculous. He once even bought me my own copy of a book just so I wouldn't touch his. For someone who seemed so relaxed about clothes, he had unusual habits like ironing his underwear. The first time I saw him do it, I couldn't help but laugh, which he didn't appreciate. Another time, after we'd enjoyed a cozy moment on his leather couch, he asked me to move so he could spray it with cleaner. It was an odd way to end the mood. At first, spending time with Lincoln was enjoyable, but over time, things started to feel off. I began to notice we weren't as close as I'd hoped. Lincoln could be fun, but he wasn't warm or affectionate. I missed the small touches and kind words my previous partner had given, things that made me feel cared for. And I started seeing sides of Lincoln I hadn't noticed at first. He had some unusual habits that he slowly introduced, starting with him playfully wearing my clothes, asking if I thought it was funny. At first I laughed it off, but he began doing it more, asking, "Doesn't this make you happy?" during dinner. I started rethinking our relationship. Lincoln's financial issues became clearer over time. He earned a decent income, yet somehow there was never any money left. I often paid for our lunches and dinners, and if we ordered takeout, I covered it. A couple of months after that lunch with my friends, he brought up money. He casually asked if I could lend him some. Trying to seem relaxed, he suggested I think about it. But by then, I knew Lincoln well enough to see through the act. When I asked how much he needed, he shrugged and said, "Oh, around $10,000, just for a little while." I wasn't naive. I replied, "I'll think about it," keeping my tone neutral. That was the beginning of the end. He never asked again, and I didn't bring it up. If he tried to steer the conversation back to money, I quickly changed the subject. He seemed to get the hint. After that, he was around less and often busy whenever I invited him out. When he did call, it was usually when I had other plans. Slowly, things faded over the next few weeks. Surprisingly, I wasn't too upset. It ended quietly, without drama, which suited me just fine. Except for one odd moment. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, a woman around my age approached me. She asked if I knew Lincoln, which made me cautious. "Who wants to know?" I replied. She held up her hands and smiled. "Don't worry, I'm not trouble. I just thought you should know something about him." I was curious. "Like what?" "Lincoln has a habit of borrowing money and never paying it back," she said seriously. "He took nearly $20,000 from me. I just didn't want you to go through the same thing." I felt relieved. I had seen the signs and hadn't given him a cent. "Too late," I said with a grin. "I didn't fall for it." She looked pleased. "I bet he still got something from you, though." That made me laugh, and it broke the tension. I invited her up for a drink. Her name was Sandy, and she had dated Lincoln a few years ago. She told me how he'd taken money from her, then pretended it hadn't happened when she asked for it back. Now, she made it her mission to warn new girlfriends about him. We spent the evening sipping wine, sharing stories, and wishing we could find happiness without the stress. Sandy seemed glad I'd seen through his act, and by the end of the night she was ready to start her mission again, saying she'd find out who he was dating next. Neither of us wanted to give up the fun of dating, but it was refreshing to spend time with someone who didn't expect anything from me. She left around midnight, and I felt like I'd made a new friend. The next 3 months felt slow. Maisie went through 2 boyfriends, breaking up with one and moving on to another only to end it quickly. I wondered if she was being too picky. But then I looked at myself in the mirror and realized she was just exploring her options. I decided to put dating on hold for a while, too. This choice helped me focus more on work. I leased several large buildings, sold 4 condos, and spent many quiet nights at home with just the TV and maybe a glass of wine. I couldn't tell if I felt lonely or just peaceful. Occasionally I went out with friends, but even that didn't excite me much. I found myself thinking about Jeff more than usual, our life together, why I'd left, and all the little things he did that used to drive me crazy. Then one day something unexpected happened. I was at Whole Foods picking up some fruit when I noticed a family nearby. A dad was joking with his 2 kids, who were both adopted from China, saying, "It's in the adoption contract." The kids, laughing, asked what contract, and he teased, "It's in Chinese. You'd never know." They were all so happy together, and I couldn't help but think of Jeff. He used to make a holiday contract with our kids, promising a certain number of playful moments tied to their gifts. They'd sign it, laughing, and look forward to the fun. At the time, I'd just rolled my eyes. Now, I saw it differently. Jeff had been connecting with our kids in a way that was special to them. When I got back to my car, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion. I sat in the driver's seat, missing his playful spirit. After 18 years together, it was only natural to have good memories, but I hadn't expected to feel so nostalgic. I realized that while my reasons for leaving hadn't changed, I was seeing our past through a different lens. One evening, those memories came back strongly. I'd just finished reading The Girl with All the Gifts and was flipping through channels when I found Some Like It Hot on Bravo. Jeff and I had a little tradition with that movie. When he traveled, he'd watch it on his iPad and we'd talk on the phone as if we were watching it together. It was our way of having dinner and a movie despite the distance. Feeling nostalgic and maybe a bit tipsy from the wine, I decided to call him. I knew calling your ex at 10 p.m. wasn't always a great idea, but I thought it might help us reconnect or even rekindle a friendship. I didn't really know what I was thinking. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding a bit concerned. He knew it was me, thanks to caller ID, and asked right away, "Are the kids okay?" I assured him they were fine. Maisie was out on a date, and Drew was at a friend's house. "No, I was just watching Some Like It Hot," I said lightly. "It's on Bravo right now, and it made me think of all those times we watched it together. Want to watch it with me?" He hesitated. "Oh, hold on a second," he said, covering the phone. I heard muffled voices. At that moment, it hit me if I had moved on, maybe he had too. The thought surprised me. This was Jeff, after all. Who would want to date him? I mean, I'd left for a reason, hadn't I? "Hey, January," he finally said, using my full name, which he rarely did. I could hear an echo like he was in the entryway with its hard floors and high ceilings. "I'm kind of busy right now. I have guests over." "Guests?" I asked, my heart sinking. "A dinner party?" "Something like that," he replied. "Can we talk another time? I actually need to discuss something with you anyway." Sure, I said, trying to sound upbeat, though I didn't feel it. Whenever you're free? Thanks, he replied. I'll call you soon. Take care. After he hung up, my emotions flipped. One minute I was feeling warm and nostalgic, and the next I was frustrated. Here I was, reminiscing with a glass of wine while he was busy hosting a dinner party. He'd wanted to talk to me. Maybe he had news, maybe someone new in his life, or some other change. But I was the one who had wanted a better life, and yet I was the one sitting alone. It didn't feel right. I was supposed to be moving forward, not feeling stuck in the past. I sat there drinking my wine and realizing I was clinging to a past I didn't even want. It was time to stop feeling sorry for myself and take charge. If I wanted a better life, I'd have to make it happen on my own. That was the push I needed. First on my list was meeting new people. Sitting in my apartment wouldn't help, so I joined a new gym, a small local one called Jiggle and Poke with community trainers. The name was cute, but my trainer, Mike, was serious about fitness. He pushed me hard, even though I was stumbling more than running. He had a strong smell from working out, which wasn't ideal, but he was dedicated to helping me improve. Next, I joined a book club. 3 weeks in, I realized it was mostly middle-aged women who liked to vent, and meeting potential dates felt more like joining a convent. But I enjoyed their company and stayed involved. I also signed up for a cooking class, partly because I was still irritated about Jeff's dinner parties. I could cook for the kids, but I'd never mastered fancy dinners. I was great at desserts, pies, cookies, ice cream, but I wanted to improve my main course skills. Plus, there were plenty of men in the class. I realized I needed a change in perspective. My feelings about Jeff moving on were more about me than him. I wanted to do something meaningful, so I signed up for Meals on Wheels to help deliver meals to those in need. Not exactly a dating hotspot, but it felt good to do something positive. I focused on my career, improved my cooking, stayed active at the gym, and even watched the younger bodybuilders with curiosity about their fitness routines. I kept dating a bit with casual coffee meetups and some online dates. Most didn't lead anywhere serious. I met Brian over coffee once, and he quickly got straight to the point about what he wanted. His openness about unique relationships was a change from my usual conversations, but soon he crossed boundaries that made me uncomfortable. When he invited me to a gathering with his friends, I realized it wasn't a joke and decided I needed to leave. I sent him a clear email asking not to contact me again. Later, I thought about how risky that situation had been, but was determined not to let it stop me from looking for a genuine connection. I continued dating, more carefully this time, but kept finding myself comparing each date to Jeff. Some didn't even match up to my less-than-stellar memories of Tom or Lincoln, let alone Jeff. I told myself that if someone couldn't meet Jeff's standards, they probably weren't worth my time. I had left Jeff because he didn't live up to those standards either, but still, the comparison was there. One night I went out with my friends and invited Sally, a new friend from the book club. We ended up at a cozy wine bar called the Purple Cafe in Redmond. Over a couple of bottles of Pinot Noir, we shared stories, talked about life, and wondered why it felt so hard to find a good partner. Well, Sally said, I love the wine and the company, but I'd give it all up for a decent guy. I know that's not a popular opinion, but it's true. Some of the others nodded in agreement, and I found myself nodding too. Then I added, but do we really need a guy to enjoy our lives? I don't know about you, but I'm doing just fine. Cindy looked at me with a raised eyebrow and said quietly, Jan, how long do the batteries in your device last? 3 weeks? Maybe 4? Why do you ask? I replied, starting to understand her point. The fact that you even know that says a lot, she said, taking a big sip from her glass. Melissa chimed in, Look, we don't need a man to be happy. We're not stuck in the past, but it would be nice to find someone special. I had to agree with that. Sally sighed, looking a bit sad. Why is it so tough? She wondered. Are there really only bad options out there? I thought about my recent dating experiences, feeling her frustration. When I left Jeff, I thought I'd have a chance to look around and find someone better suited for me, I said. It's like walking into a bakery with so many choices, but nothing seems right. At least you had that choice, Jan, Sally replied with a soft smile. She had lost her husband in an accident a few years ago. From what she shared, their marriage hadn't been easy, but losing him like that must have been painful. I often wondered how I'd feel if Jeff were no longer around. Why was I even thinking about him? I'm sorry, Sally. I didn't mean to bring up sad memories, I said genuinely. She shrugged, carefully holding her glass, and nodded, accepting my apology. The thing is, Cindy chimed in, I feel like all the good ones are already taken. If they're really good guys, they're probably with someone already, right? What woman would let go of something special? I noticed a tone I didn't quite like. Not all of them are perfect, Cindy. Sometimes you leave for your own peace of mind. Cindy stared at me, then glanced at Melissa, who had been mostly quiet. Melissa gave me an encouraging nod. Was he really that bad? She asked gently. I knew they'd all been wondering. Even I had sometimes. No, not exactly, I replied, surprising myself. It was just little things that piled up. Things that got on my nerves to the point where I felt I had to get away. It's like he could annoy me just by being there. What kind of things? Sally asked, leaning in. Oh, you know, tiny things. Like 1,000 little annoyances. Nothing big on its own, just a lot of small stuff. Like leaving the toilet seat up, whistling while he cooked, snoring, and laughing at silly shows. I could feel myself getting worked up just listing them. Sally raised her eyebrows. He whistled while he cooked? That sounds harmless? It sounds small, but it was so annoying, you have no idea. So you left your husband because he whistled while making dinner. Did you ever bring it up? Well, not really. I mean, I complained about his snoring for years, but nothing changed. What was the point of mentioning every little thing? What could he have done about it? Melissa asked, setting her drink down. I don't know, maybe some surgery? Or something for his sleep issues? Melissa raised an eyebrow. You wanted him to get surgery for snoring, but you never even told him about the whistling? Not exactly. He knew it annoyed me. So did you ever leave the room when he annoyed you? No. Why would I leave the room? I replied, realizing how my words sounded. Sally leaned back, giving me a look. I know these things sound small, but you weren't there. You didn't experience how often it happened. It was everyday small things that wore me down. But he didn't force you into anything uncomfortable, right? Sally asked, almost as if she was trying to understand Jeff better. I laughed. The idea was funny to me. She clearly didn't know Jeff. No, if anything, it was the other way around. He never pushed me to do anything I didn't want to. Honestly, if we had shared more fun moments, maybe I would have stayed. Jan, he doesn't sound that bad, Cindy said thoughtfully. He wasn't hurting you or pushing you, and he cares about the kids. Sure, but that's what most married men do. I don't want to be married to just anyone. I want some excitement, some fun. Not every night, but once in a while. I felt like I needed to explain my choices. I could see the others listening, and it made me stand by my decisions. The truth is, I need more. I want more than just a steady job and a simple house. I want a partner who dreams big. Did I care about him? Yes. Do I still care about him? Yes. That last part slipped out before I'd really thought it through. Then why leave him if you love him? Sally asked, sounding curious rather than challenging. She was new to the group and didn't know much of our history. I sighed, feeling a bit tired. My reasons had been so clear back then. Was it a year ago already? Time had flown by. I still wanted a life that felt like my own, with things that excited me. There had been more negatives than positives. I couldn't handle the frustration anymore. I needed more. I think I still do, I admitted, revealing more than I'd meant to. Sally noticed and raised an eyebrow. Think? Are you not sure anymore? I shrugged, wanting to steer away from this path. I picked up an empty wine bottle and changed the subject. More wine, ladies? If we can't find the perfect partner, at least we can enjoy good wine. They smiled and nodded, letting the topic shift. I poured the wine, noting silently that I was paying for this nice bottle. Not that I minded, but a little thank you would have been nice. That's how life went for a while, occasional nights out. Lots of running around helping seniors with Meals on Wheels. I learned a lot about cooking, discovering what made a good stew versus a bland one. Some of the meals I delivered made me think about starting a small food business, imagining I could do better. But I decided delivering was enough for now. One day, while delivering meals, I parked in a spot I probably shouldn't have to make it easier to step out. Sometimes the seniors like to chat, and I didn't mind, though I had other things to do. When I returned to my car, a man was standing nearby looking impatient. I'd blocked his car. I gave him an apologetic smile and raised my hands in a silent, "Sorry," then quickly moved my car. He watched me with a bit of irritation as I drove away. Little did I know that brief encounter would lead me to meet Damon. That's just life in the city, I thought, brushing off the incident. Sometimes you end up in these situations, you shrug, move on, and try not to dwell on it. Life's too short for negativity. The following week, I delivered a meal to Mrs. Pegler, and this time I stayed to chat for about 20 minutes. She was like living history, full of stories that fascinated me. When I returned to my car, parked correctly this time, I saw the same man again. But this time he had a friendly smile and held a bouquet of flowers. He called out, and I walked over. He handed me the flowers and said, "I'm really sorry about last week. I was in a rush and didn't mean to be rude. Please accept these as my apology." It's not every day a man apologizes with flowers, and he was quite charming. I didn't even remember what he had said the previous week, and honestly, I didn't care. A kind gesture is a kind gesture. He had nice blonde hair, a strong build, and a warm smile. I later found out he'd been a boxer. This was Damon. He was attractive and clearly thoughtful, visiting his mom in the building every Wednesday. I found that endearing. Damon was 46, divorced, and figuring out life as a single man again. He worked in real estate, specializing in cleanroom facilities for tech industries. It sounded technical and not too exciting, but Damon had plenty of charm to make up for it. He was intelligent, confident, and had a quick wit. He invited me for coffee, which quickly turned into dinner and eventually breakfast, with plenty of enjoyable moments in between. We began seeing each other 3 times a week, and it felt like a real connection was forming. But as time went on, I started noticing little things, much like I had with Tom. One evening at a nice restaurant, I noticed Damon watching me eat with a smile. "What's going on?" I asked, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Nothing," he said, looking back at his plate. "Really? What is it?" I pressed. "It's just the way you eat is different from what I'm used to," he said. "In finishing school, they taught us the European way." He began showing me his proper eating technique, which seemed overly complicated. "See?" he said. I glanced around the restaurant. "Seems like a lot of effort for a regular meal. Besides, I don't see any Europeans here, do you?" I smiled to show I wasn't upset, but he sighed instead. "It's just so typical of Middle America," he said. "You manage well, but it could look a bit more refined." This was my first experience with a subtle put-down, or negging, where someone criticizes you in a way that makes you doubt yourself. It's a tricky way to make you feel like you need their approval. Damon kept up these small, backhanded comments, and soon I found myself doubting things I'd always felt fine about. Over time, his comments became more critical. He'd make fun of me for switching my fork to my other hand, which left me feeling embarrassed and trying to change the way I ate. Then it moved on to my clothes. One day I wore shorts, and suddenly that wasn't okay. I started noticing the disapproving looks from him, and sometimes from others too. Next, he criticized my shoes, saying I should wear heels to look more ladylike. It didn't stop there. He began commenting on the color of my walls and even my choice of underwear, suggesting styles that made me uncomfortable. I know people have preferences, but these choices didn't feel right for me. They didn't fit my style or what I liked, and I resisted. But Damon kept pushing. When I said no, he'd subtly point out better options whenever we were out, taking me to stores and making comments. Some store clerks looked embarrassed for me, while others nodded in agreement, making me feel even worse. We talked about respecting personal choices, and he'd smile and agree, only to ignore it later. The clothes and personal style critiques were annoying, but they were only the beginning. Damon started suggesting that he wanted to expand my experiences, which sounded fine at first, but his approach felt controlling. He'd introduce me to his friends, acting more like he was showing me off than sharing his social circle. Damon was charming in public, always putting on a great show. But over time, I saw it wasn't about kindness. It was about control. He liked to test people's reactions, pushing them just to see if he could sway their opinions. It was subtle at first, but as I saw more of his true nature, I realized how controlling his behavior was. Behind that friendly charm was a side of him that wanted to shape everything and everyone to his standards. He directed that same push toward me, only with more intensity. Looking back, I should have noticed sooner, but somehow I wasn't fully aware of what was happening. After some time, I talked things over with friends and began to see the red flags. Damon was charming, clever, and had a lot of friends, many of whom we met over dinners and outings. Most weekends, when I didn't have the kids, we'd go out and Damon would introduce me to new couples. The conversations were often straightforward, but sometimes caught me off guard. At first, I felt shy when he steered our conversations into unexpected areas. Damon had a knack for guiding the direction of every chat, leading us into adventurous topics as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Early on, he asked if I'd ever done anything daring. I hadn't, and I was fine with that. It wasn't something I'd felt I needed to change. But he made it sound intriguing, and with the encouragement of the couples we were with, I found myself trying new things, even if they were out of my comfort zone. Soon, Damon pushed me to explore more, even suggesting I wear bolder outfits. I felt a mix of excitement and unease, but I followed along. Damon would say things like, "You have to stretch your boundaries," or, "People have wider limits than they think." He argued that being open-minded made us better people, and that narrow thinking held us back. On some level, his ideas made sense when applied to social issues, but when it came to personal choices, it felt off. Still, I couldn't see things clearly because I was so wrapped up in it. Damon kept me busy, always out with him or his friends. The only time I had for myself was when I was with the kids, and I definitely wasn't discussing any of this with them. I had a few chats with Melissa and Cindy, but that was about all the contact I had outside of Damon's circle. One night at a motel, where he insisted we leave the curtains open, something finally made me start questioning everything. Then, the following week, we met a couple named Martha and Simon. They seemed ready for an eventful evening. After drinks, we returned to the hotel. Damon drove, and I later realized this limited my options. We had connecting rooms, and when Damon and I shared a close moment, I noticed the other couple watching from their side of the room. As the evening went on, Martha was suddenly beside me. Nothing intense happened, but they came much closer than I'd anticipated. That night felt strange, like I was slowly being led somewhere I hadn't agreed to go. It reminded me of the metaphor of a frog in warming water, not realizing how the situation was changing until it was almost too late. A few days later, I met Melissa for lunch, which turned into an all-afternoon talk. I even canceled an appointment to keep talking with her. As I described recent events, both of us started to see things more clearly. I realized that Damon was influencing me in ways I hadn't noticed. It was unsettling to see the truth that someone I trusted could have hidden motives. I wanted to believe the best about Damon, but his words about new experiences had clouded my thinking. The turning point came the following weekend at his house, which overlooked the river. I was looking forward to a quiet evening together. We were chatting and laughing in his hot tub when the doorbell rang. Damon got up, and 15 minutes later he returned with another man named Morton. They both smiled as they entered, and I felt a mix of confusion and unease. "January, this is Morton," Damon said, as if this were a normal introduction. Morton started undressing, and I sank lower into the water, feeling exposed and caught off guard. "Oh, don't be shy," Damon said, smiling. "He's just here to talk business with me. Nothing to hide in a hot tub, right?" Damon chuckled, trying to make it sound casual. Morton, meanwhile, looked at me with an unsettling gaze. I suddenly realized this wasn't an accident, it was planned. I could see how the night would unfold. More drinks, some business talk, subtle flirting. And despite my reservations, I found myself going along with it. I didn't object, even though I felt uncomfortable. We talked about contracts and work over drinks, with Damon sitting close, occasionally brushing my hand. The warmth, the atmosphere, it all worked to make me believe maybe this was okay. But deep down, I knew I was only playing along to keep both men content, and I felt more like a spectator than a participant in my own evening. I didn't enjoy myself that night. I felt like I was just there to keep them happy, making it feel like an obligation rather than something I actually wanted to do. After less than an hour, when both men were finished, my mind started to drift. I went to bed while Damon was seeing his guest out, pretending to be asleep when he came back. I could hear his breathing as he lay down, and my frustration grew. I held back tears, not wanting to wake him. Quietly, I packed my things and slipped out. Driving home, I felt disgusted by what had happened, and by how much control Damon had over me. The half-hour drive felt like it lasted forever. When I got home, I poured myself a drink and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I reminded myself that I was better than this, that I didn't deserve to be treated like that. I promised myself it wouldn't happen again. Jeff would never have treated me this way. He had a genuine respect for me. I cried that night, mourning how I had allowed myself to be manipulated and for the path my life seemed to be taking, despite all my efforts to stay in control. I thought of Jeff and realized he was a good man who didn't deserve the choices I had made. I finally went to bed at 3 a.m. and slept late into the next day, with no plans for the weekend. When I checked my phone, I saw several messages from Damon, but I chose to call Melissa instead. Bless her, she came right over. We talked for hours while I stayed in my pajamas, sipping hot chocolate, my comfort drink for tough times. Melissa brought her laptop and showed me articles about manipulative behavior, which opened my eyes. After I told her what happened, anger and disappointment flooded over me. I told Melissa, and later Cindy, who joined us, that I wanted to be free from Damon, no explanations, no arguments, just free. I realized I didn't want to give him another chance to manipulate me because I wasn't sure I'd have the strength to stand up for myself. So I decided to cut him off entirely. I learned about ghosting, cutting off all contact, through a friend who dealt with a similar situation. At first, I thought the term was funny, but then I realized how powerful it could be. I blocked his number, limited all ways he could reach me, and ignored his emails. It was time for a clean break. For about 5 weeks, Damon didn't seem to accept that I was gone. Some mutual friends reached out saying Damon mentioned my sudden disappearance, but I knew they were trying to reconnect us, and I wasn't going to let that happen. I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Damon even showed up near my apartment a few times. I arranged to borrow Cindy's car for a bit so he wouldn't recognize mine. My building has secure parking, which needs a remote to enter, so I felt somewhat safe. I didn't even consider asking Melissa to lend her car. She'd never part with her special vehicle, even for a friend. I noticed him outside a few times, usually on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So, by the second week, Cindy's husband, Paul, started driving me home. He'd come inside for a while, and I'd call Cindy on FaceTime to reassure her everything was okay. Eventually, after 2 weeks of waiting outside, Damon stopped showing up. A week later, Cindy and I switched back cars, and she joked loudly, "Wow, that Nissan SUV is really nice. I wish I had one." Her husband just shook his head, smiling. With Damon finally gone, I started focusing on rebuilding my life and reputation. I couldn't shake the disappointment I felt in myself that night. I wondered why I hadn't felt this level of regret when I left Jeff. Should I have? Did it mean I didn't love Jeff as much as I thought I did? Something felt off. The next 3 months were peaceful. I took cooking classes, even joined a Chinese cooking class, and continued with Meals on Wheels. I became close with a few regulars, and one day I found one of them had passed away. It was a shock, and that night I had a few drinks to process the experience. Thankfully, she had left instructions for her memorial, and her pastor reached out to her family. Life moved on, and I decided to stay away from dating. Maisie settled down with a boy she saw often, and I finally got to meet him. He seemed like a respectful kid, had a little hoop earring, but was polite and attentive to Maisie, which was all I wanted as a parent. Drew, too, was growing up fast. He started coding lessons after school and told me he wanted to create video games someday. I was a bit surprised, but it made sense. He'd always been curious, asking questions about how things worked. I found myself more interested in how video games were made than in playing them. "Not everyone at NASA is an astronaut, right?" Drew had said, and it made sense. I focused on work, and when I closed a deal on a big office building, I was able to put a good chunk toward Maisie's college fund. I emailed Jeff about the plans, and he reassured me he'd help cover the rest. That gave me some peace, but I couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness. Dating again felt daunting. The past year had shown me how tricky it could be, especially at my age. I often thought about my relationship with Jeff, trying to pinpoint what went wrong. He was a good man, and I realized that wasn't easy to find. Or maybe I just wasn't great at choosing the right person. One evening, Melissa jokingly suggested, "Maybe a different path is calling you." It was a funny thought, and though the idea of dating a woman had its appeal, Melissa and I both felt drawn to more traditional relationships. Then, as if out of nowhere, I met Tony. I was in the grocery store's frozen food aisle looking for chestnuts for my cooking class when I noticed him. He had a bright, warm smile and his gaze lingered on me. It was a nice feeling, refreshing even. There was no ring on his finger or any sign he'd recently worn one. My cautious side kicked in, making me wonder why he was single. Tony had a light tan, dark blonde hair just starting to gray, and a kind face with laugh lines. He wasn't built like a bodybuilder, but had a friendly, easy-going look. Standing at about 5'11", he had a vibe like a low-key Robert Redford, with a square jaw and gentle eyes. His voice was smooth with a Texan accent that was charming. Words like ma'am, reckon, and y'all would sneak into his sentences, and it always made me smile. When he asked me for coffee, I hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. He was funny, attentive, and relaxed, not trying too hard but still making an effort. After my recent experiences, I kept my guard up, but he was patient and didn't mind taking things slow. Our coffee dates soon turned into lunches, and over a few weeks our relationship grew at a pace I was comfortable with. Tony was open about wanting to spend time together and was perfectly fine with going slow. I liked that I could control the pace. There was a little bit of lighthearted flirting, but it was all respectful, and I felt myself enjoying his company more and more. He had been in a long-term relationship that ended when his partner left to pursue other things, and after dating casually for a year, he realized he wanted something more meaningful. I wasn't head over heels right away, but I liked him more with each date. From the beginning, it was clear he genuinely liked me, which was nice for a change. He planned most of our outings, and I enjoyed feeling pursued. It reminded me of when Jeff and I had first started dating. Tony had a special way of making people feel comfortable, like they were the only person in the room. One time, we were waiting in line for food at Chick-fil-A when an argument broke out between two families about their kids running around. I stepped back, unsure of what to do, but Tony went right in, calming them down with a few jokes and smiles. The way he diffused the tension was impressive. He truly had a gift for connecting with others. I even joked that he should consider it as a job, but he laughed and said it was too tiring. In 3 months, we'd gone from feeling okay to comfortable to genuinely happy together. It was exactly what I needed. I introduced him to Melissa and Cindy, and when he went to the restroom, Melissa gave me a thumbs up while Cindy joked about him having a brother. Even though Cindy was married, it was still funny. Tony had this perfect mix of humor and charm that made everyone around him smile, while also making me feel special. One night, we went out with another couple, and I watched how easily he fit in with everyone. I don't necessarily believe deep friendships form overnight, but he seemed to get along well, showing genuine interest in the people we met. By the end of 3 months, I felt like everything was falling into place. There were no red flags, no confusing behaviors, just kindness and care. I even introduced him to Maisie and Drew. They weren't overly excited, but they accepted him, and for a teenager, that felt like a win. It all seemed too good to be true. I spent 3 months expecting something to go wrong, but it didn't. I kept waiting for some hidden flaw to surface, but nothing major did. Sure, there were little things. Tony wasn't perfect after all. He had a habit of being a bit messy, which was a minor annoyance, but honestly, I didn't mind. Tony was laid back in some ways, but particular in others. He'd only do laundry when absolutely necessary, often at the last minute, and never ironed his clothes. He had a thing for reality TV, liked to sleep in, and usually skipped breakfast. He'd sometimes ask random questions out of nowhere, which could be a bit distracting. I'd often wish he'd be more assertive when I needed him to be, or more patient when I felt he was pushing too hard. Then there was his quirky collection lunchboxes from the 1950s filled his basement. I could only wonder what his ex had thought of that. These were small quirks, and while some were mildly annoying, they were also things I could overlook or help him improve over time. I found myself thinking, this is it. This is why I went through all those ups and downs to find him. After a few mistakes, I'd finally found someone who felt right. One thing I noticed early on was that Tony couldn't lie. He'd try to soften his answers but couldn't hide the truth if I asked him something directly. Surprisingly, he had a way of being honest without being hurtful. If he thought my hair was a mess or my outfit wasn't great, he'd say it so gently that I'd end up seeing it myself instead of feeling offended. It was refreshing, the opposite of my past experiences. With Tony, I didn't need to guess or coax his thoughts out. Our connection felt natural and easy. I knew I didn't need wild excitement. I'd had my share of that and found it only brought trouble. I just wanted a real, steady connection. Since being with Tony, I felt more content. My thoughts about Jeff softened too. I still remembered the good times and some of the bad, but those memories seemed lighter now. Maybe I was just finally moving on, or maybe Tony was helping me see things from a new perspective. Oddly enough, I realized I hadn't seen Jeff in person for over a year. We'd been polite at school events and exchanged emails or texts about the kids, but we hadn't actually been face-to-face in 14 months. I'd been busy, and with the kids keeping a distance, I didn't hear much about Jeff's life anymore. Our communication had improved a little, but I still felt that leaving him had been the right choice. Meeting Tony had only reinforced that. Recently, I'd had a medical checkup, a routine one, though always a bit uncomfortable as we get older. I ended up waiting for almost an hour, and with my phone battery low, I decided not to waste it. Instead, I flipped through the outdated magazines on the coffee table. I picked up an issue of Time and found an article about a new educational toy that was trending. It was a small, interactive device designed like a house, with screens on each side that showed a family living inside. The game's appeal was its adaptability. It could be set to match a child's age and interests, teaching them about history, culture, and famous books. The screens had a special effect, giving the illusion of peeking into a real house. It sounded clever, and for a moment I wondered if Jeff had been involved. But after a quick search, I realized it was from a smaller Boston-based company, not one Jeff's team would typically work with. Still, my thoughts drifted to him. Jeff had always had an eye for creative, meaningful projects like this. I wondered if he'd appreciate the idea behind it. Just then, Tony arrived at the doctor's office to pick me up, and any lingering thoughts of Jeff faded. Tony and I were finally in sync. We agreed on what mattered and genuinely cared for each other. I found myself daydreaming about a future together, maybe even moving in and building a life side by side. Tony often talked about his work managing a few malls for a real estate company. His job involved overseeing security and handling the logistics of keeping everything running smoothly. I hadn't thought much about that kind of work before, but he explained it in a way that made sense. It seemed Tony was both organized and reliable, qualities I'd come to appreciate more than ever. In a way, everything felt like it was finally falling into place. I felt ready, excited, even for what might come next. He was quiet for a moment, holding my hands as if trying to find the right words. "Jan, I'm honored that you're here with me. Tonight was important, and I wanted you to be part of it. That's all I meant by special." I never thought... His voice trailed off, and he looked away as though he was struggling with what to say next. I sat there feeling a mix of disappointment and embarrassment. I'd been so sure that this night would be more than just a celebration of his award. It seemed clear in my head, but I could see now how I had let my own hopes take over. I looked down, trying to hide the emotions swirling inside me. "Jan, I care about you deeply," he finally said, his voice sincere. "But I wasn't planning any big steps tonight. I wanted to celebrate this moment with you, to have you by my side for something that meant a lot to me. I never meant to make you feel like there was more." It was hard to hear, but I appreciated his honesty. I nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. This wasn't the fairy tale moment I'd been hoping for, but at least he was being open with me. We sat in silence, and I tried to gather my thoughts. "Thank you for telling me," I replied quietly. I guess I just got carried away, thinking this would be a turning point for us. Tony gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Jan, I'm not saying that there won't be a next step, just not tonight." I managed a small smile, trying to show him I understood. "I think I just got ahead of myself, but thank you for wanting me here. It did mean a lot." With that, we settled back into bed, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The night hadn't turned out the way I'd imagined, but maybe it was a reminder that things don't always go according to plan. As I lay there, I realized I needed to let go of the picture I'd painted in my mind and allow things to unfold naturally, even if it meant waiting a bit longer for the future I dreamed of. The next morning, as we shared breakfast and talked casually, I felt a sense of calm. I hadn't gotten the commitment I was hoping for, but I was with someone who cared about me, someone who wanted me to be part of his life, even if it wasn't the happily ever after just yet. I decided to take it one day at a time, grateful for the journey I was on, wherever it might lead. My voice trembled as I asked, "Why can't we?" Tony looked at me, puzzled. Why can't we what? I took a deep breath, trying to hold it together. Move in together. Make this something real and lasting. I watched his expression shift from surprise to something else, something serious. He pulled his hands away and leaned back, clearly thinking hard. "Jan," he began, "I'm never going to ask you to marry me." He said it calmly, meeting my eyes with a steady gaze. I felt my heart drop. "What? What do you mean?" I stammered, my voice unsteady. "Look, what we have is great, Jan, but I don't want to get married. Not to you or anyone. I'm happy with how things are." I could tell he was trying to be kind, to spare my feelings, but the honesty stung. "But why?" I asked, confused and hurt. "I thought we were building something. Shouldn't we be moving forward?" He looked down, gathering his thoughts. "Jan, you're a remarkable woman, driven, determined. You know what you want, and you go after it. I admire that about you." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But sometimes your focus is so intense that it feels like there's only one way forward your way, and when reality doesn't match that vision, it creates tension." My frustration started to grow. I took a slow breath. "Please, just be honest," I said, determined to hear everything. He nodded, looking a little weary. "Okay then. Sometimes. You can be a bit intense, a bit demanding. It's not all the time, but it's there. The space we have in this relationship helps us. But if we were married, living that close every day, I don't think it would work. We're just different." I felt a mix of anger and hurt. Part of me understood he was being as honest as he could, and yet it hurt to hear. Here was the man I thought might be my forever, telling me I wasn't enough for him. Tony's voice softened as he continued. "I just think we're good where we are, Jan. Nothing more, nothing less." I took a deep breath, letting his words settle. "I need to go," I said quietly, standing up and looking around for my things. "Please don't go like this," he pleaded, watching me gather my clothes and slip on my shoes. "What we have is good. I've never connected with someone like I have with you. We don't have to end it." I found my bag, and as I reached for the door, I looked back. "Goodbye, Tony," I said firmly, leaving no room for doubt. Out in the hallway, I took out my phone and called for a ride. As I stepped into the hotel lobby, the bright lights and distant sounds of conversation seemed strange and distant. My car arrived quickly, and soon I was headed home, the city lights blurring past. My driver, Wanda, chatted non-stop during the ride. I gave polite responses, trying to keep my thoughts focused on the stars outside. In less than 35 minutes, we pulled up to my place. I went inside, slipped off my clothes, and took a long, hot shower. Afterward, I poured myself a small glass of cognac, savoring the warmth as it went down. I sat out on the balcony, gazing at the moon and the view over Bellevue. My thoughts were a mix of frustration and sadness. I felt hurt and let down, trying not to dwell too much on what Tony had said. I knew my flaws. I didn't need them pointed out by someone I'd thought might be my forever. Why did I keep picking the wrong partners? My expectations never seemed to match reality. After a while, my emotions took over. I stood up, leaned over the balcony, and tossed my glass into the night, letting out a long, frustrated scream. It felt oddly freeing. Then, aware of my neighbors, I quickly slipped back inside, not wanting to explain any outbursts. I didn't want to break more glasses, especially the ones from my wedding set. I went to bed, determined not to cry, and finally drifted to sleep. The next couple of days, I took off work. Cindy and Melissa saw I was having a tough time, so they came over to keep me company. I didn't bother changing out of my pajamas. I just didn't feel like it. We watched movies, ate ice cream, and shared a few bottles of wine. I let out my feelings, and they comforted me like true friends do when someone's heartbroken. Tony called once, but Melissa answered and told him I was doing fine, no need to worry. I felt foolish for believing there could be a future where there wasn't one. Then, out of nowhere, my sister Tina showed up. Family has a way of getting right to the heart of things, don't they? Especially my older sister. She just knocked on the door one day saying, "Hey, little sister, how's life treating you?" Just what I needed, no warning. She walked in with a bottle of Jameson Reserve and after a quick hug said, "Dinner's on me. We'll eat. Come back and celebrate. Go put on some jeans. I'm starving." I blinked, trying to figure out how she'd even found my new place. We'd been out of touch for so long that she didn't know about my divorce or the move. Still, there she was, as if she'd known everything. I felt off balance. I'd been managing my own life for a while, but when Tina showed up, I felt like a kid again, caught between surprise and admiration. She looked great leaner, deeply tanned, with hair naturally sun-kissed from the sea and sun. She was small, maybe 5 or 6 inches and 115 pounds, with short hair and bright brown eyes. We didn't look much alike. I'm taller, closer to 5'9" inches and about 20 pounds heavier, though with a bigger frame. My hair's chestnut brown and I have blue eyes. Our personalities, though, couldn't be more different. I'm more energetic and intense while she's calm, thoughtful, and quick with dry humor. Still, she can be sharp when she needs to be, especially with her British-style sarcasm. She has a knack for pointing out when someone's taking themselves too seriously, usually me. "Come on, Jan," she laughed. "Are we just going to stand in the doorway? I come bearing gifts." She held up the bottle with a grin. "You can't disappear for 3 years without bringing a gift. Now go get changed and let's go eat. We have a lot to catch up on, and I didn't come all this way to stand around." I'd forgotten how fast she talked, how naturally she expected me to fall in line. Maybe we were more alike than I thought. "Of course," I mumbled, stepping aside. She put the bottle on the table and looked at me, waiting. I just stared back. "What?" "Oh, for heaven's sake, come here." She pulled me into a hug, and I relaxed, catching the familiar scent of oranges in her hair. "Oh, Tina," I murmured, feeling the tears come. She pulled back, holding my shoulders. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, but I'm here now. Let it all out, little sister. Tina's here." She looked at me, understanding the hurt I still carried from Tony, even though it had been a few weeks since I'd seen him. I'd kept busy with work, hadn't been enjoying much beyond my routine. "Go on," she encouraged, giving me a little nudge toward the bedroom. "Get changed, and let's go get something good to eat. My treat. Then we can talk like old times." I managed a small smile, realizing how much I'd missed her. Sometimes being around the right people is exactly what you need to feel whole again. I headed to my bedroom and pulled on some jeans while Tina chatted from the other room, her voice filling the condo with that lively energy I'd missed. "I stopped by the old house to surprise you," she called out, "and found out you'd left him. I guess we'll have plenty to talk about tonight." "Your place is lovely, by the way," Tina said as she wandered around, stopping to admire the big windows that opened out onto the balcony. While I struggled into some old jeans and searched for socks to match my ankle boots, I heard her open the balcony door and step outside, only to return a moment later. I glanced at myself in the mirror a bit rushed, but good enough. When I walked out, I found her flipping through a cookbook. "Cooking, huh? Is there no end to these new skills of yours?" she asked with a smirk, holding up How to Be a Domestic Goddess. "Not much room for this on a boat, you know. I'm a bit envious. You have a beautiful place, Jan. Really nice." I let out a small laugh. I didn't have much choice but to set up somewhere. "Well, that was your call, wasn't it?" she said, her directness cutting through like always. I sighed and she softened a bit. "Let's save the deep dive for after a few drinks. You'll be more open then." And so we headed out. She'd driven over in another Prius, which surprised me a bit. She caught my raised eyebrows as I explained on our way to Gaucho Grill, a top-notch steakhouse I'd chosen, figuring she could treat us both. Once we'd settled at the restaurant, ordered our drinks and picked our meals, filet with lobster for me, a flaming steak skewer for her, she lifted her glass, giving me a warm smile. "So, where should we start, January?" she asked. "You left Jeff, moved out, started fresh, and somehow found friends who think your daughter's ungrateful. What a journey. Where do we even begin?" I sighed, knowing this was coming the moment I opened the door to her. There was no escaping it. I'd have to share everything, my choices, my reasons, and she'd inevitably analyze it all in that way only sisters can. She must have noticed my hesitation because she offered a crooked smile. "Oh, come on, sis. With everything going on, can you blame me for being curious?" I took a breath, then started at the beginning, explaining the events leading up to my split with Jeff, the building unhappiness, and eventually the fallout with Tony. I tried to be as honest as I could. Tina's always been good at spotting half-truths and would press me until I laid it all out. She listened intently, reacting with understanding and occasional surprise, letting me feel safe to speak openly. Somehow that made everything easier. We savored the meal, worked through a bottle of wine, and even started on a second. As I finished sharing, I leaned back, fiddling with my wine glass, watching the condensation form. Finally, after a quiet pause, I turned to her. "So, what's new with you?" We both laughed. It was the perfect, light-hearted break. She raised her glass, smiling, and toasted, "To my sister, whose life is never dull." I managed a half-smile, then asked, "But really, what have you been up to? Any wild stories from the South Seas?" She shifted in her seat, smiling as she looked down. That's a story for another time, Jan. Sailing around those seas can be a bit quiet sometimes, though I had the right company for it." Then she changed course. "But back to you. I need some clarity on a few things." I took a deep breath, sensing the direct questions were coming. "You know," she started, "I actually saw Jeff. He's the one who led me to your place. It was supposed to be a surprise, but honestly, I didn't rush over. In fact, I dropped by yesterday and ended up having dinner with him." She paused, watching my reaction. "It's quite revealing hearing your side now. Helps me see the full picture." "The full picture?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. "Come on, Jan," she said, leaning in. "When you're caught up in something, it's hard to see it clearly. Jeff has his own perspective on all this, too. Talking with both of you helps me understand what's really going on." Despite myself, I was curious. I hadn't really known how Jeff was doing lately, and if I was honest, there was a small part of me, the not-so-gracious part, that hoped he wasn't exactly thriving. "So how is he?" I asked as casually as I could manage. Tina saw right through me and teased, "You could just call him and find out, you know." I shook my head, my frustration slipping out. "The last time I tried, I was left reeling for days. I mean, who throws a full dinner party as a single guy these days?" Tina tilted her head, her voice teasing. "Who said he was single?" My heart skipped a beat as she added, "Just joking." But the hint still lingered. She leaned in again, her expression serious. "Let me get this straight, Jan," she said carefully. "You left Jeff because his job and personality didn't match your goals, right?" Her words hit a nerve. I could feel the frustration bubbling up. "No, Tina, that's not it at all. I just wanted something different." And even though I'd said it many times before, somehow I realized I wasn't entirely sure what that something different was anymore. That was my usual answer when people asked about my feelings. Most people get it. Everyone has moments when their partner doesn't seem to see things the same way. But Tina? She wanted specifics. "What exactly did you want that he didn't?" she pressed. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. My usual answer had been enough for everyone else, but Tina wasn't one to let things slide. "Jeff, just he wasn't ambitious," I finally said. "Look at his job. Is that really the kind of work someone with his education should be doing?" "He has his PhD, Jan," Tina reminded me, raising her eyebrows. "Got it 6 months ago." I blinked. "I didn't know that," I said quietly. The kids hadn't mentioned it either. "Well, he does," she said firmly. "You think making toys is beneath him? Who should be shaping the next generation's toys if not someone smart and caring like Jeff?" I felt my cheeks heat up. When she put it like that, I wasn't so sure. But I pushed back, saying, "It just wasn't the right fit for me for us." Tina rolled her eyes. "You know, Jan, you can be a bit of a snob. You didn't even try to see what Jeff saw in his work." I crossed my arms and tried not to look defensive, but Tina pressed on. "So things weren't great, right? You were tired of it all. Fine. But what did you actually do about it besides getting frustrated and dreaming of this perfect life? Did you try to bridge the gap?" I shifted uncomfortably. I'd never thought about it like that. Tina noticed my expression and continued. "Isn't it true that you didn't do much, Jan? You were upset that Jeff wasn't who you wanted him to be. But instead of talking to him, you just got more annoyed, waiting for him to read your mind." I bit my lip. "It wasn't that simple," I murmured. Tina shook her head. "No, Jan, it was simple. Jeff loved you. He wanted you to be happy. gave you space when you asked for it, and you left without even trying to work through it." Her voice rose, drawing some looks from the tables around us. She took a deep breath, lowering her tone. "Jan, all Jeff ever wanted was to make you happy. But did you ever really try to make it work?" I looked down. "It just wasn't working for either of us," I said, my voice soft. "I thought ending it was best." "For who?" she challenged. "Did you even ask Jeff what he wanted?" Her words struck deep. I'd never fully considered how my choices might have blindsided him, but hearing her talk about it now made me see it differently. She went on, "You know, Jan, you always expected the world to change around you. But how's that worked out? Have these new relationships filled the gaps Jeff couldn't?" She didn't give me a chance to respond, which was probably for the best because I had no good answer. "Jeff isn't here to blame anymore," she added. "It's just you now, Jan. What does that tell you?" Her words made me feel raw and vulnerable. She was right. I'd been thinking the same thing in recent months, though I'd always found reasons to push the thought away. After all, it wasn't my fault Tom didn't like kids, or that Damien had unique interests, or that Tony didn't want more. But Tina wasn't done. "Jan, the only common thing in all these relationships is you." She leaned back, watching me. There was no smugness, no "I told you so" in her eyes. She looked at me seriously, waiting for me to say something, anything. I felt the weight of her words, but I wasn't ready to admit she might be right. "Listen, Tina," I said, voice tight. "It's easy for you to judge. You haven't been here through all of this." I jabbed a finger in her direction, feeling the need to defend myself. "You've been off living your own life. I was the one here feeling trapped, trying to get out." She held my gaze, unflinching. "Oh, Jan. Always quick with an excuse," she said quietly. "So tell me, has this new life given you everything you wanted?" I opened my mouth but couldn't think of a good response. She shook her head, disappointed. "See, Jan, this is what I mean. Instead of really hearing me out, you're just finding excuses, avoiding the truth. And for once, I didn't have a comeback. My marriage is still strong, you know why? Because I learned that it takes work from both sides. It seems like for you, you had 2 kids, got a job, and then thought that was it. But relationships need more than just going through the motions, Jan. It feels like you just gave up." I sighed, trying to explain myself. "Am I not allowed to be happy, Tina? Should I have just settled into the perfect wife role and forgotten about myself? You know I'm more than that. I felt trapped, like I was going to break if I stayed." Tina took a deep breath, clearly frustrated. "But did you ever talk to Jeff about that feeling? Did you try to really work it out?" "I think Jeff understood when I left," I said, a little defensive. "I mean, he must have known how I felt." Tina raised her eyebrows. "No, I don't mean yelling at him for everything he did wrong. I mean sitting down and actually talking to him. Did you ever do that?" It hit me then that I hadn't. "No," I admitted quietly. "I just never did." She shook her head. "Jeff thought about calling you afterward just to talk. He wanted closure, but he couldn't bring himself to do it because he thought you'd shut him down. So he respected your decision. He loved you enough to let you go, and you just kept going, moving on to one thing after another." Her words were sharp, but she wasn't wrong. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "You already had what you were looking for, Jan, but you couldn't see it. You turned it into something else, made it about everyone but yourself. You've always done that." Her voice softened, but her words cut deep. Then she murmured, "Wrong side of smart," and picked up her glass of water. That phrase sent a jolt through me. "That's not fair," I snapped, louder than I intended. People in the restaurant turned to look, but I didn't care. The phrase echoed every hurtful thing I'd ever heard, every comparison to her, every time I felt I didn't measure up. "What?" Tina looked at me, surprised, but I kept going, voice quieter but still firm. "I'm not stupid, Tina. Don't you dare use that phrase on me, just like Mom used to. I've had enough of that my whole life." Tina's eyes softened as she reached across the table, taking my hand. "Jan, that's not what it means." "Yes, it does. Wrong side of smart, it means the opposite of smart. It's just another way of saying not smart enough." She looked at me with genuine surprise. "No, Jan, that's not what it meant at all." I wiped my eyes, confused and a little vulnerable. "Then what did it mean?" Mom didn't think you were not smart enough, Jan. Do you remember those intelligence tests we took as kids? You scored higher than me, 13 points higher. Mom didn't tell you because she knew you'd make a big deal out of it. I stared at her, surprised. I would have bragged about it if I'd known. And yet, here she was, telling me something that changed how I looked at myself. What Mom meant, Jan, is that you're smart in a different way. You have a knack for understanding your feelings, for explaining them, for finding justifications when you need them. You're quick to figure out why you feel a certain way, and you're good at coming up with reasons for your side of things. You know how to defend your decisions, even if it means not fully facing them. She paused, letting that sink in. So when Mom said wrong side of smart, she meant you have a talent for arguing your side, sometimes so well that it becomes hard to see anyone else's perspective. Her words stirred something deep within me. It was unsettling but rang true in a way that was hard to ignore. I looked at her, really taking in what she was saying. I felt like for the first time, I was truly listening. I was so focused on my own feelings, blaming others, that I hadn't even thought about my own part in all of it. It wasn't just Jeff's mistakes, you know, Tina continued. You never really talked things over with him before you got upset. But in your mind, that was his fault too, right? You explained your feelings but never looked at what you were bringing to the relationship. She leaned back, giving me a knowing look. And your attitude, always defensive, makes it even harder to connect. I bet right now you're more focused on coming up with a response than really listening to what I'm saying. Her words hit me. Usually I would jump in and defend myself, but this time I just listened. Was she right? Had I been missing the point all along? Look at your life since leaving Jeff, she said. You've been searching for someone to make you happy. You thought you'd found it a few times, but each time it didn't last. You keep expecting others to fill this void, and you get upset when they don't. She held out her hands. You expect happiness to come from them, not from you. I sat there, a bit stunned. Was I really like this? I thought I knew myself, but her words made me wonder if I had been ignoring the truth. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. I thought back to my behavior over the years, how I criticized Jeff's job, dismissed Drew's interests, overlooked Maisie's feelings, and made excuses for my own choices. These memories came flooding back, and I realized how I had hurt people, all while thinking I was right. I was so quick to judge others, but maybe I hadn't looked at myself clearly. Finally, Tina said softly, Well, are you still with me? I'm hoping you don't hate me for saying all this. I gave a small chuckle. Of course not. I probably needed this, even if I don't want to admit it. Tina looked relieved. Good. It's hard to say these things to someone you care about. After a pause, I said, There's a lot to think about. And there was. I didn't know what else to say, but I knew this conversation would stay with me. I felt like I was seeing myself for the first time, and the view wasn't exactly pretty. Facing the reality of who I was, of who others saw me as, was overwhelming. It was like realizing I'd been the bad guy in my own story all along. For the next few days, I felt low. Tina stuck around to check in on me, and even helped me find a therapist. She came to a few sessions to share her perspective, which helped me see the full picture. It didn't take long for the therapist to help me peel away the layers of excuses I'd built up around myself. I thought I was smart, but as I faced the truth, I finally understood what the wrong side of smart really meant. I was clever, but only in ways that let me dodge responsibility, keep my ego intact, and avoid facing my flaws. Session after session, I learned that I'd been hiding behind my own explanations, using my quick thinking to make excuses rather than listening to others. I thought I was better than everyone else, smarter, wiser, and that made me think I was always right. But I was only fooling myself. I realized that many things I had believed were my strengths had actually hurt others. I had dismissed their feelings, downplayed their needs, and justified my actions as right, simply because they felt right to me. As the truth settled in, it changed everything. Seeing myself clearly wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I began to understand just how deeply I had hurt people, including Jeff, by putting my own needs above theirs. The realization hit me hard, and there were many nights I sat alone, grappling with the weight of what I'd done. I was finally seeing the cost of my actions, and for the first time, I was truly ready to change. The process of realization hit me like waves on the shore, starting with that intense talk with Tina and continuing over the following weeks. It really came to a head when my therapist asked me why I had felt it was okay to leave my marriage. I launched into all the things that had frustrated me about Jeff, which I'd explained countless times before. She listened carefully, jotting down notes. Then she pointed out that all my reasons were negative. I hadn't even tried to balance them with the good things. I'd only focused on what annoyed me, blaming Jeff for everything wrong. It struck me that I had twisted the facts to suit my narrative, ignoring any positives in our relationship. I'd used my own reasoning to justify my actions, filtering out anything that didn't support my decision to leave. As my therapist put it, some people can't see what's in front of them, and it's even worse when they convince themselves there's no need to look. This was a truth I couldn't ignore. I knew I had apologies to make, not just to Jeff, but to my kids, friends, and even to Melissa and Cindy. I began taking small steps to make things right. I found inspiration in the concept of a 12-step program focusing on accountability without needing to place the blame elsewhere. I wanted to reach out to those I'd hurt, and above all, I needed to face Jeff. Thinking about how unfair I'd been to him during our marriage brought up so many memories. I saw how much resentment I'd carried and how dismissive I'd been, even when he'd tried to connect. Looking back, I realized how wrong I'd been to judge him so harshly. Despite my flaws and all I'd put him through, he had cared enough to stick around as long as he did. Listening to a song my dad loved, I realized I had taken what we had for granted. I had convinced myself that I was missing something I deserved, without ever stopping to see the good right in front of me. It dawned on me that while our marriage hadn't been perfect, I could have tried harder to connect with him, to see things from his perspective, to work through it instead of always pulling away. Now that I understood my own role in our issues, I felt waves of guilt. Not just for how I had treated Jeff, but also for how distant I'd become with my own kids. It was painful to admit I'd avoided connecting with them because I didn't know how. In therapy, I had finally accepted this truth. I couldn't turn back time, but I wanted to rebuild what I could. It was time to reach out to Jeff. When I called, he sounded surprised. We hadn't had a real conversation in ages. The fact that I knew so little about his life now only added to my regret. How had I become so distant from someone I'd once shared everything with? When I asked him to come by so we could talk, his first question was about the kids. Is something wrong? It was a reminder of how dedicated he'd always been to them. I assured him it wasn't about the kids, and then the dreaded words slipped out. We need to talk. He actually chuckled and replied, No, Jan, I think we talked enough when we were married. His tone was calm but tired. I could feel my heart tighten. I fought to keep my voice steady. Jeff, please. It's not what you think. I need to say some things, mostly to apologize. I said the last part so quietly I almost couldn't hear it myself. There was a pause, and then he asked gently, Jan, are you okay? You sound different. Is everything all right? Hearing the concern in his voice only deepened my guilt. Well, no, Jeff, I admitted. Things have become clearer to me, and I realize now that I made some big mistakes. I don't know how to make it right, but I'd like to try. Would you come by sometime? I have a lot to say, and most of it is about you. After another pause, he sighed. Jan, this isn't a great time. I've got a lot on my plate right now. We're about to launch a new toy, and there's a legal issue we're working through, so... A legal issue? I interrupted, surprised. Jeff had always seemed so far from anything involving lawyers and courtrooms. He was a creator, not a businessman wrapped up in legal matters. It's a long story, he replied. I could sense he was busy, and I didn't want to push too hard. But even just this brief exchange was enough to remind me of his patience, a quality I'd overlooked so many times. And I knew that whatever happened next, I had to make things right with him, for both our sakes. Actually, yes, that's the one, Jeff said with a small nod. It's that uncle's family toy that's caught so much attention. We showed them a prototype when we first pitched the idea. They said thanks, but no thanks. And then a few months later, they launched something almost identical. Now, we're in this messy legal situation. Wow, Jeff, I said, genuinely surprised. I never thought you'd be dealing with lawsuits. You used to hate anything to do with legal stuff." He shrugged and gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, me neither. But this is more about standing up for what we created. I guess I've changed a bit." I nodded, understanding his resolve. For a moment I felt a pang of regret, realizing how little I knew about the changes he'd gone through. Here was Jeff, someone I once thought I knew better than anyone, now growing in ways I hadn't been there to witness. "So," he said, shifting in his chair, "what was it you wanted to talk about, Jan?" I took a deep breath, glancing down at my coffee cup, steadying myself. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Jeff. About, well, everything, really. Our marriage, my choices, and how things ended between us." He listened without interrupting, his gaze gentle but attentive. "I realized," I continued, "that I was so focused on what I thought I was missing that I didn't see the good things we had. I blamed you for a lot that wasn't really your fault. I left without trying to work through things, and I think I hurt you more than I ever intended." Jeff looked down, his expression thoughtful. "Jan, I can't pretend that it didn't hurt or that I didn't wonder what went wrong. But I also know you weren't happy, and I thought maybe letting you go would give you that." I felt a surge of gratitude for his honesty. I know now that leaving wasn't the answer. I should have been more honest with you from the start instead of letting all those small things build up inside. I'm sorry, Jeff. I really am. He met my eyes, a hint of a smile playing on his face. "Thank you, Jan. I appreciate that." We sat in silence for a moment, just letting the weight of everything settle. I felt a sense of peace, like a chapter was finally closing, allowing me to move forward, even if I wasn't quite sure what that future looked like. "So, where do we go from here?" I asked, my voice soft. Jeff took a deep breath, as if he too was searching for the right words. "I don't know, Jan. I think we both need to figure that out. But maybe we can take things slowly, see where life takes us. I'd like to be in each other's lives, even if it's in a different way than before." A warmth spread through me at his words. It wasn't the sweeping romance I'd once dreamed of, but it felt real, honest. "That sounds good, Jeff," I said, smiling. "One step at a time." He smiled back, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of calm. We didn't need to have everything figured out. All we needed was to be open to what came next. As he prepared to leave, I walked him to the door, feeling lighter than I had in months. We shared a brief hug, a small but meaningful gesture. "Take care, Jan," he said as he stepped out. "You too, Jeff. Safe travels," I replied, watching him walk away, knowing that whatever happened next, I was finally ready to face it. I could tell Jeff was trying to find the right words. "I do believe you're sorry, Jan," he said slowly. "I believe you see things differently now, and that you've gone through some real changes." I nodded, feeling the weight of my words settling between us. "I have, Jeff, and I know it took losing you to realize what I had." He looked down, gathering his thoughts. "The thing is," he said, "I had to move on too. I was hurt, and I had to find a way forward. I'm glad you're seeing things clearly, but I don't know if I can just go back to what was. Too much has happened." My heart sank, but I knew I owed him honesty. "I understand. I really do. And I'm not asking to pretend like nothing happened. I want a chance to build something different, maybe a fresh start. No pressure, no expectations." He was silent, his gaze drifting to the window for a moment. "Jan, it's hard to forget the pain, the way things ended, but I can't deny that it means something to hear this from you." There was a softness in his eyes as he looked back at me, and for a second, hope flared up inside me. "So," he said, "what are you asking, really?" "I'm asking if you'd be open to spending some time together," I said, choosing my words carefully. "No labels, no big promises, just maybe dinner here and there. Let's see if we still connect." He nodded, thoughtful. "I think I could do that," he said, a small smile forming. "But I have to be honest, Jan. I don't want to end up in the same place we were. We'd have to go slow, really slow." I smiled, feeling a sense of relief. "That's all I want, Jeff. Just the chance to get to know each other again." He looked at me with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. "Then maybe we can start there." It wasn't a grand reunion, but it was enough a quiet hope, a small step forward. As he left, I watched him walk away, knowing this was just the beginning of something new, something real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Seeing this new side of Jeff felt surreal. In all the years we were together, I'd never seen him so grounded, so sure of himself. He had moved on in a way I never anticipated. "I never thought I'd hear this," I managed to say, still processing his words. "It's just, I'm shocked." He gave a small, understanding smile. "I know, Jan. When you left, I was lost. It took me a long time to find my footing again. For a while, I didn't know how to be the kind of dad Drew and Maisie needed. It was hard to show up for myself, let alone for them." I felt tears welling up. "Jeff, I didn't realize any of this. I should have, but I didn't. You couldn't have known. You were busy finding your own way. I asked the kids to avoid talking about you around me. It was too painful. I couldn't stand hearing about your new life." He paused. "But eventually, I found a way to move forward." I sat there, unable to look away. "That's when I met Amber," he continued. "She understood what I was going through. We leaned on each other. One thing led to another." Amber. The name felt strange, but I kept listening. He sighed and looked at me with a hint of regret. "We just got married. In fact, after Boston, we're heading to the Bahamas for our honeymoon." The news felt like a punch to the chest, so this was why Tina had been so gentle with her advice. She must have known. He didn't have a wedding ring on, and I realized I'd been glancing at his hand. Jeff noticed and said, "The ring's being resized. Amber got the wrong size, and it takes a bit to fix." I couldn't help but ask, "Does she make you happy?" He nodded. "Yes, she does. But Jan, I want you to know your apology means a lot. I really needed to hear it. It's just that part of my life, our life, it's closed now." I held back tears, searching for strength I didn't feel. "I understand. I want you to be happy." He gave me a long, thoughtful look. "I don't want to shut you out. We'll always be connected through the kids. When I get back, let's have dinner. You can meet Amber. For now, just focus on them. Maisie should be here soon. Drew and she were arranging a ride when I left." He glanced at his watch, then stepped closer, concern in his eyes. "Will you be okay, Jan?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, I'll manage. You know me." He hesitated, still worried. "Are you sure?" "Yes, go, Jeff. You have a honeymoon to enjoy, and I have the kids to focus on. It'll be fine," I said, though we both knew my words were thin and fragile. As he reached the door, he stopped and turned back. "Jan," he began, his tone soft. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you realized this too late. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but I hope you can find peace with it. I've let go, and I hope you can too." I gave him a sad smile, grateful for his kindness even though it hurt. "Go on. Enjoy yourself. We'll talk when you get back." He nodded, and as he left, I felt both lighter and emptier. Maybe I didn't get the ending I'd wanted, but perhaps I'd gotten what I needed. Once he was gone, I poured a glass of wine, texted the kids to see when they'd be over, and started planning a trip to the Science Museum. Drew would love it. Life kept moving, and I knew I had to live it too. As for Amber, well, I hoped she was good to him. Hey everyone! Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.